President Trump and his border czar, Tom Homan, said the mass deportation of migrants in this country illegally would begin with dangerous criminals, the worst of the worst, they said.
But CBS News has learned that among hundreds of alleged gang members deported this past week to El Salvador was a Venezuelan migrant with a job and no criminal record in the process of seeking asylum.
His family believes he is now being held among some of the most dangerous prisoners in the world.
And they have no way to get in touch with him. Lilia Luciano now with his story. Lilia.
We traveled to Northwest Arkansas to meet with a man's wife who's cross-country traveling because she fears she too could be targeted, but more so is in fear that her husband is being mistreated indefinitely in a place filled with very dangerous people. The pictures are striking. More than 200 Venezuelan deportees flown on U.S. government planes out of Harlingen, Texas last week and brought here, one of the world's most notorious prisons. El Secot in El Salvador. Heads shaven, arms shackled. The Trump administration says these men are all members of criminal gangs. We've learned at least one of the men believed to be deported here has no known criminal record. Franco Caraballo is a 26-year-old barber who was living with his wife in Dallas. He turned himself in at the southern border more than a year ago and requested asylum, and was detained last month during a routine check-in with ICE. His attorney, Martin Rosenow, showed us DHS documents confirming Caraballo has no criminal history.
So now they're saying, on paper, he's believed to be a gang member.
With no known criminal history.
No criminal history and no explanation.
No explanation whatsoever. Venezuelan
authorities provided information that says there's no evidence Caraballo was in a gang or had any criminal record there. Rosenow says Caraballo was deported to El Salvador and has not been able to communicate with him.
He had no suspicion, no clue that he could end up in a place like Secot.
We had no idea. Not him, not his wife, not anyone.
Is his family concerned that Secot is worse than Venezuela?
They are concerned that it's worse. I'm concerned that we have no access. Who has custody over our client? Who has jurisdiction? El Salvador? ICE? The U.S. government? We have no idea.
In the DHS deportation document, agents highlight Caraballo's tattoos, but don't explicitly say they are connected to gang activity.
Why did he think that they were going to deport him for the tattoos?
Por el reloj.
Because of a clock.
El reloj tiene la fecha de nacimiento de su primera hija.
A clock that marks the time when your daughter was born.
Mm-hmm.
His wife, Johanny, says she last spoke to her husband the day before he was deported.
What worries you about him being in this prison?
Que me preocupa de que él es inocente.
That he's innocent.
Y el maltrato que está recibiendo allá adentro.
You think he's being mistreated in there?
Exactamente.
The deportation of these Venezuelan men is in front of a federal judge who ordered the Trump administration to not send them to El Salvador in the first place and gave the government a deadline of tomorrow at noon to explain why they did not comply with the order.
Lilia, I remember when you reported on Secot and you said it was essentially a black hole. Is that why it's so hard to find out if Caraballo is in there?
That's absolutely right, John. It's a place that has a half of a mile of a radius where cell phone signal is blocked. Well, the prisoners will never get visitors, where they cannot make phone calls, hear from family members. And this is a government that is known for a lack of transparency. I asked the Bukele administration about this case and the rest of the Venezuelans there, and they said, we'll share these images, but not any more information.
Lilia Luciano, thank you.
We have an update now on a story we've been following closely, the deportation of hundreds of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador without due process.
The Trump administration insists they are criminals and gang members, but as we've reported, there is reason to believe some are not.
Lilia Luciano talked to another wife who insists her husband is no criminal and no gang member, and then Lilia spoke to the president's border czar.
By now, you've seen the videos from El Salvador. More than 200 Venezuelan men deported from the U.S. and dropped into one of the world's most dangerous prisons, known as Secot.
¿Tú lo reconociste?
Sí.
You recognized him?
One of the faces in the crowd is Nice's partner, she says.
How did you feel when you saw the prison?
Mucho temor, miedo.
It was terrifying to see the videos.
She's 9 months pregnant, past her due date.
Él no va a estar presente.
He's not going to be there when his child is born.
Her partner is Henry Albornoz. The 29-year-old crossed the southern border more than a year ago. She says he's been working as a mechanic in Texas and was detained in January during a routine check-in with federal agents. According to his attorney, Albornoz has no criminal record here or in Venezuela.
He has never been a gang member.
No, nunca tuvo involucraciones en eso.
He was never involved in any criminal activity.
No, una persona muy trabajadora, muy pendiente de la familia,
He's a
muy
good man,
responsable, primero su
responsible.
hogar ante todas las cosas.
His family first, above all things, hardworking.
The Trump administration says the men deported were all members of a criminal gang called Tren de Aragua, known as TDA. But we reported last week on a similar case where a Venezuelan migrant with no known criminal record also landed in the Secot prison. We came to the White House to talk to the border czar, Tom Homan, to better understand why the government says that these men are all terrorists.
I've been told by the highest levels of ICE, the men and women of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who built that manifest, who went to each of these files, spent hundreds and hundreds of hours investigating each and every one of these people, that they are in fact, every one of them, a member of TDA.
How do you know they are all members? Have you seen that evidence?
I have not drilled down every file. Again, I'm trusting the men and women who do this for a living.
Is it possible that the administration made a mistake by sending 238 men saying that they are TDA members, assuring that they're all TDA members without us seeing
I'm not
what
aware
the
of any
evidence
mistakes
is?
at all, but I can tell you this, not every gang member has a criminal record.
And Lilia Luciano joins us now from Washington. Lilia, we've been wondering from the very beginning here, for those with no criminal record, what's their recourse? How do they get out of this situation?
Maurice, that is a great question. I have asked the government of El Salvador, and they said, you have to ask the U.S. government. That is why I wanted to sit with Tom Homan. He referred me to the courts, said that's going to be figured out in courts. I asked, can they be brought back to get that due process? He said it's up to the DOJ, but the Department of Justice is refusing to answer any questions about the deportees to the very courts.
The president's border czar has long insisted that migrants in this country illegally are being carefully vetted before they're deported.
But now the administration is admitting that at least one migrant was deported accidentally. It blames an administrative error.
An error that has the migrant, who had been living in Maryland, sitting tonight in one of the most dangerous prisons in the world, in his native El Salvador. A judge has blocked his deportation there because his life would be in danger.
The migrant's wife and 5-year-old son are U.S. citizens. He was on board one of those planes filled with Venezuelan and Salvadoran migrants deported to El Salvador last month, all of them alleged to be criminals and or gang members.
But as we have reported, there is reason to believe some may not be. Nancy Cordes is at the White House. Nancy?
Good evening. This man's family says he's a union member, full-time sheet metal worker supporting an American wife and a special needs child. The White House says he may have been sent to prison by mistake, but that he's dangerous and now deserves to stay there. ICE officials now admit this man was not supposed to end up at the notorious Secot prison in El Salvador. In a new court filing, they say the deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia was an administrative error and an oversight.
What they're saying is, yeah, we messed up, so what?
Simon Sandoval-Moschenberg is his lawyer.
What we're asking right now is for the government to ask for him back from the government of El Salvador.
Right now, Trump officials are saying no. Vice President J.D. Vance called Abrego Garcia a convicted MS-13 gang member with no legal right to be here.
Is Kilmar a gang member?
He's not a gang member. The allegations against him are based on whispers and shadows.
What is clear is that Abrego Garcia fled gang violence in El Salvador when he was 16. In 2019, an immigration judge issued a grant of protection, which prohibits him from being deported back to his home country for his safety.
This individual was an MS-13 ringleader.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
The judge ordered that he should remain in this country. So are you saying that it is okay to ignore a judge's ruling if you don't like it?
Who does that judge work for?
He's an immigration judge.
An immigration judge who works for the Department of Justice at the direction of the Attorney General of the United States, whose name is Pam Bondi, who has committed to eradicating MS-13 from our nation's interior.
Right now, the White House seems to be saying they don't want to ask for him back.
No, unfortunately they don't. It's appalling to me. I've had wrongful deportation cases before, including in the last Trump administration. And in every single such case, as soon as they realized what they'd done, they bent over backwards. They moved mountains to get these guys back.
This case is shining new light on the cases of other men whose families say they were sent to Sikot in error.
Not every gang member has a criminal record.
Our colleague, Lilia Luciano, asked Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, about the vetting that took place before deportees were flown to El Salvador.
I've been assured numerous times that everybody in that plane from Venezuela was a TDA member. The rest of them were MS-13.
And Nancy, as you showed us, the press secretary, that is, said this is all up to the Attorney General. Is that the way this works?
Not exactly. Immigration judges do technically report up to the Attorney General, but that doesn't mean that she can simply ignore an immigration judge's ruling that someone needs to stay in this country. She could call for it to be reviewed. She can challenge it, but there is a process for that, and it was not followed in this case.
And the man in this case, Nancy, was not convicted, despite what the vice president said, right? And if so, how did he get on the list?
Well, he wasn't originally on the list. He was considered an alternate, but there was a manifest with a lot of names on it that started dropping off for various reasons. And so he kept moving up the list. And there was no notation there that he was not supposed to be sent out of the country, John. ICE officials are describing this as a, quote, good faith oversight.
Just a few seconds here, Nancy. What happens next in this case?
There is a court hearing on Friday. His lawyers want the judge to call on the government to ask El Salvador to send him back. But the government's lawyers are arguing that the judge simply has no jurisdiction here because the man in question is now out of the country.
We turn now to what immigration officials are calling an administrative error. That error sent Kilmar Abreu Garcia, a protected legal resident in the United States, to a prison in El Salvador last month. Our legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, we don't have much time. Tell me what we know about this gentleman's legal status.
Well, we know his status was essentially withholding removal, which means that he is in this country and he is not slated for deportation because there's been a finding that he would be subject to harm in El Salvador. And so ICE apparently understood, and the government understood, that this was somebody who was not to be subject to deportation plans because of the potential harms that occur. He lives in the United States. He's married to a citizen, and he has a 5-year-old child who's a citizen.
And the White House says they won't bring him back. Do they have a legal theory or just not going to do it?
So the legal theory here is that he is in El Salvador and that the court lacks jurisdiction to make any sort of argument or order to say he needs to be taken back to this country. We talked about this before with respect to the use of the Alien Enemies Act, which is actually not the statute that the government's pointing to here, but in this question of when do federal judges lose jurisdiction. Clearly, he is in a different country, and the government is saying, legally speaking, we can't do anything anymore, or at least a court can't order anything. Of course, that the channels of diplomatic channels are still open, but that's the legal argument.
Under 30 seconds, Jessica, any recourse for him and his family?
He's brought a civil suit. He's brought a civil suit saying that his due process rights have been violated, that the government violated immigration statutes. This is a big test to see whether or not there is any recourse. If a court says no, that could obviously embolden the administration.
All right, Jessica Levinson, thank you so much, as always. The Maryland father mistakenly sent to prison in his native El Salvador is suing the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security. Kilmar Abreu Garcia says a judge granted him federal protection in 2019, and this should have prevented him from being sent back to El Salvador. To discuss the case, I'm joined by our immigration reporter, Camilo Montoya Galvez. Camilo, tell me where this case stands right now.
Good evening, John. Jennifer said that the accusations the White House is leveling against her husband are false, telling me that he has no criminal record in the U.S. or connections to any gangs, and her husband's arrest has had a huge impact on their 5-year-old disabled son, who, like Jennifer, John, is a U.S. citizen.
When they were about to take him, The ICE officer let me say goodbye to him. I was standing right next to him because my son would stretch out his arm to tell him, like, let's go. And then the officer told him, you have to say goodbye to him.
How did your son deal with that situation at the time?
So him and my son are very, very close. When my husband was sitting on the curb, my son gave him a very tight hug. Kind of like my son kind of knew that something was wrong.
If you had the opportunity to talk directly to President Trump, what would you tell him?
I would tell him to please bring my husband back with me, my kids.
And John, while it has conceded and admitted that this deportation was a mistake, the Trump administration is rejecting demands to return Abrego Garcia to the U.S., alleging that he's a gang leader implicated in human trafficking. The White House, however, has yet to offer any concrete evidence to support those claims.
So what can be done, Camilo, to get Abrego Garcia back?
Well, John, the Trump administration is arguing in federal court that judges in the U.S. have no jurisdiction over this case because this man is now in the custody of the Salvadoran government and being detained at the maximum security prison in that Central American country, and that his lawsuit against the government is meritless because he is no longer in American immigration custody. But his lawyers are saying to this federal judge in Maryland that they do have standing, John, because the U.S. is paying Salvadoran officials to detain deportees like Abrego Garcia. But outside of this lawsuit, there doesn't appear to be any mechanism for the family to get back together.